Kim Philby, Britain's anti-James Bond. Kim Philby is probably Britain's most famous spy, after James Bond of course. He's also Britain's biggest traitor. For 30 years he lived as a double agent, manipulating his peers, denying his communist ideals while rising up to the top echelons of MI6 before defecting to the Soviet Union in 1963. He was born prior to World War I in Punjab, India, where his parents were stationed. His father was a member of the Indian Civil Service, a well-known author and Muslim, and later became a civil servant in Mesopotamia, an advisor to King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. His family had a high stand in the British Empire, the ruling class. As he grew older, he studied at Westminster School and latterly at the famed University of Cambridge, where he read history and economics. Cambridge was where Philby was first drawn towards communism as part of the famous Cambridge Five, a group of 5 Cambridge students who would later go on to become Soviet spies. But he wasn't truly drawn towards the Soviet intelligence service until after graduation. Philby moved to Vienna in the early 1930s, working to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. He loathed the Nazi movement, and whilst there he fell in love with Litzy Friedman, a young Jewish communist from Austria. Philby recalls that on their first meeting he was struck by the strength of her political convictions. Philby liked her determination. They got married and fled Austria in 1934, prior to the outbreak of World War II. Coincidentally, the same year, an NKVD, Russian secret police agent, Arnold Deutsch, was sent to London and managed to get in contact with Litzy regarding the recruitment of Soviet spies. Litzy told Philby one evening she'd arranged for him to meet a man of decisive importance, and the rendezvous took place in Regent's Park. The man described himself as Otto, but Philby found out much later from an MI5 file that the man was indeed Arnold Deutsch. From that moment on, Philip began feeding information to the Soviet Union, with his first task for Otto being to give a list of names of those he met at Cambridge who might respond to discreet contact. While Philby himself states that it was his time in Cambridge where he became involved with communism, it was Litzy who got him in touch with the Soviet Secret Service. Philby travelled to Spain in 1937 in the midst of a bloody civil war. He started working as a freelance journalist for British paper The Times, reporting from the pro-Franco side and stationed in Seville. He wrote favourable articles about Franco, but meanwhile Philby kept providing Soviet intelligence with information. They were interested in seeing how the new Messerschmitt and Panzer I and IIs were deployed in the nationalist forces. Philby also informed the British intelligence that, after a direct question to Franco, German troops would not be allowed to cross through Spain and attack Gibraltar, at that time an important British stronghold. Philby used the war in Spain to get closer to the British intelligence service, to make it look as though he'd adopted a more right-wing ideology, following Franco and his nationalist forces. Nevertheless, his loyalties were still set firmly in the Soviet camp. His Soviet controller, Theodore Mali, and the NKVD had even briefed Philby on the need to discover the system of guarding Franco and his entourage, with assassination in mind. Philby was instructed to report the vulnerabilities in Franco's security and recommend ways to gain access to him and his staff. It remains to be seen whether such an act would have been possible. Such was his pretense. He was even awarded with the Red Cross of Military Merit by Franco. In fact, during the Spanish Civil War, the nationalist forces had started to think all the English were a lot of communists, as so many were fighting in the international brigades. Philby became an exception, and he was well liked, even being decorated by Franco himself. He became known as the Englishman decorated by Franco, and that opened a lot of doors for him. Indeed, his actions in the war led him to be recruited to MI6 training in 1938. He impressed his seniors during World War II whilst working in black propaganda with Special Operations Executive. During his time here, Philby remarks in a lecture given to the East German Intelligence Service just how easy it was to get confidential information and secrets from the British Secret Service. All he did was go out 2 or 3 times a week for a pint with the archivist who managed the files. They became friends, and this friendship helped Philby get access to files not even remotely related to his job. Every evening he'd leave the office with a big briefcase full of reports and actual documents from the archive. He'd hand them over to his Soviet contact the same evening. The documents would then be photographed and the next morning back in Philby's hands and returned to the archive. Philby remarks that if there had been proper discipline in the handling of papers in the SIS, that would have been quite impossible. Philby did this year in, year out, providing the Soviets with an immense amount of British intelligence. Philby was almost caught later as Walter Krivitsky, an ex-Soviet intelligence officer, gave evidence to the MI5. Krivitsky claimed that 2 Soviet agents had penetrated the British Foreign Office and that one worked as a journalist for the British newspaper during the Spanish Civil War. Unbelievably, no connection with Philby were made, and Krivitsky were, probably not surprisingly, shot in a Washington hotel room a year later. Philby then moved up in MI6 after impressing the Director General. He were appointed number 2 as they reopened their Soviet affairs section after war. MI6 had put a Soviet double agent in charge of countering Soviet espionage. This was a huge coup for the Soviet intelligence, as it gave Philby access to highly sensitive documents just in time for the start of the Cold War. In this position, he was well able to protect his old Cambridge 5 buddies, Blunt, Burgess and McLean, and he also informed his Soviet handlers about Konstantin Volkov, a Soviet diplomat who was informing London about the Soviet spies working in the British Foreign Office. Volkov were arrested by the KGB, interrogated and subsequently executed. At the height of the Cold War, Philip was posted to Washington DC to be the liaison between CIA and MI6 as the USA and Britain ramped up their intelligence operations. Whilst there, he betrayed a US-British joint operation to secretly send thousands of trained Albanians back into Albania to overthrow the communist Soviet-leaning regime of Enver Hoxha. Philby leaked the information to the Soviet Union, and the operation failed, with many of the infiltrators being killed before the coup started. Philby himself tries to turn this to his credit. He claims his actions helped prevent World War III. He believes if he had not compromised the operation and it had indeed succeeded, then the CIA and MI6 would have attempted the same in countries like Bulgaria, after which he believed the Soviet Union would have become involved, leading to an all-out war. Such was the trust shown in Philby's ability that in 1950 it was discussed that he might become the Director General of MI6. However, MI5 ran a security check on Philby, and the evidence of Volkov was studied in detail. Suspicion also arose at the speed of which Philby rejected his communist beliefs he had held at Cambridge and adopted the right-wing views throughout and following the Spanish Civil War. Things got worse for Philby as 2 of his old Cambridge friends defected to the USSR in 1951. Philby was arrested, but cleared of any wrongdoing. Harold Macmillan, ex-Prime Minister but then Foreign Secretary, publicly dismissed a claim made by the New York Sunday News, which claimed that Philby had acted as a Soviet spy, saying he carried out his duties ably and conscientiously, and I have no reason to conclude that Mr. Philby has at any time betrayed the interests of his country. Philby set up a press conference to deny he was a communist, quite against his nature, as he had spent most of his life trying to avoid publicity at all times. The British accusers withdrew the claim, and Philby seemed to be in the clear. He moved to the Middle East to work as a journalist, but still worked part-time for MI6. In 1961, a KGB agent defected to the West, providing evidence that Philby had been part of a spy ring that also included his old Cambridge friends Burgess and McLean. MI5 sent Nicholas Elliot, an agent and good friend of Philby, who had earlier believed his innocence, to secure his full confession. When they met in late 1962, Philby told Elliot he had been half expecting to see him. Elliot confronted him, saying, I once looked up to you, Kim. My God, how I despise you now. I hope you've enough decency to understand why. Philby admitted the charges of espionage, but fled to Russia before a written statement was arranged, whence he obtained political asylum. While MI6 received plenty of criticism for Philby's defection, it's said that that was the preferred outcome for the SIS, avoiding a lengthy, embarrassing and very public trial in London. Putting it simply, Philby was able to get away with his betrayal for so long due to the British class system, and the fact that his colleagues, men of his own high class and education, just couldn't believe that an Englishman of his type, born into the ruling class of the British Empire, charming, utterly confident and popular, would ever dream of being a double agent for those awful Russians. He made so many friends in MI6, impressed so many people in high positions who would have so much to lose if he was proven to be a spy. It took him years of careful planning to get into the MI6, starting with journalism, being with and talking to right people, building contacts with the establishment. He was even able to remove and replace his own boss in MI6, which Philby says was a very dirty story, but after all, our work does imply getting our hands dirty from time to time. In a top-secret speech to East German spies, he gives one piece of advice to the spies before him. Never confess. If they confront you with a document containing your handwriting, it's a forgery. Just deny everything. Kim Philby, the finest British spy and Soviet hero.